International Affairs Analyst Johanna LeBlanc joins us now for more on this. She is in Washington, D.C. Nice to see you, Johanna. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
First direct question. Why is NATO trying to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia? Because there are some analysts who say that will probably be one of the few ways that this can be brought to an abrupt end.
I think the idea is that the world does not want to go to war, right? Even here in the United States, I think that while the crisis in Ukraine is grave and it's severe, it's obviously a humanitarian crisis, but the notion of going to war is not something that NATO countries are willing to bet on because we know what war does, right? It costs lives. We have to send our children, our sons, our daughters, and people just want. I think NATO countries just want to find a diplomatic solution to this crisis without having to go to war.
Now, the Russian president has been very direct and has been very firm in what he wants to see to end this. One of that is a guarantee from the United States and other allied powers that the Ukraine will not be allowed to join either NATO or the EU. And he says unless he gets that guarantee, he is going to keep up with this. That is a deal breaker, is it? Or is there a way of going around that to give him some kind of assurance because he seems hell-bent on this?
I think the economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia will add significant pressure because at the end of the day, we know these sanctions will further cripple the country's economy. Just today, the U.S. passed legislation to ban energy imports from Russia. And we see the oil ban. We see a number of other economic sanctions, which will have a tremendous economic impact on the country's economy. So I think at some point, Russia, President Putin will have to look at and say, hey, am I going to continue with aggression, with war, or am I going to allow my people to suffer? Because as we know, sanctions don't impact people at the highest level, right? It impacts the ordinary people, the children, the mothers, the family, your day-to-day workers. So I think these sanctions that are being imposed by the U.S. and other member nations will add the pressure that is needed in order for Putin to rethink his strategy.
The other way of looking at this, of course, is to say that if the sanctions cripple Russia's economy and so on, then its top command is likely to become more difficult to negotiate with. And so the hopes of diplomacy winning out at the end of the day, especially for people who are now crippled, may also be a tall order.
I would disagree. I think that when Putin starts to really look at the reality, and I'm sure that Putin strategized this. He and his team looked at the pros and the cons of if he were to engage in war and hostilities with Ukraine, what are the possible outcomes? So I'm sure all of these sanctions were anticipated. But again, I really believe that these sanctions will cause Putin to be more engaged in diplomatic talks with NATO countries and obviously the United States.
Let's look at things from Ukraine's perspective now. Ukraine is desperate. It's calling for a no-fly zone because right now its skies are virtually under Russian control and the bombardments are heavy. The civilian toll is quite heavy, but its allies prefer to send it other kinds of weapons. Is it in a position that some might describe as short or medium term untenable because Russia is simply too strong?
I agree with you, but however, I think we have to look at it again from the perspective of these other nations. If, let's say, the United States were to send ammunition to Ukraine, that's war, and Russia would attack. And we know Russia has very sophisticated ways of attacking other nations, not the ordinary ways of war and bombing. It could be done through cyber attacks, right? And we saw what happened during our last elections, how our systems were hacked. And I think there's a great fear by NATO countries and other countries across the world of possible cyber attacks by Russia. So countries have to be very strategic in how they engage in this war between Ukraine and Russia. And secondly, there are impacts to this war, such as the cost of gas. Here in America, we see the gas pumps. It's getting more and more expensive each and every day. It is estimated that by next week we're going to be paying $6 a gallon. So I think these types of strategies were intended by Putin because he knows the position that his country plays in terms of delivering fuel to the rest of the world. So I think at some point, again, nations will have to look at what is happening in their country and how can they work with Putin and Ukraine to ensure that we find a diplomatic resolution to this crisis. But also, I think it's a great opportunity for African nations like Nigeria, Libya, Angola to provide oil to the rest of the world.
Before I let you go, I must ask you then, I mean, it looks like from what you've analyzed, there's incentive for both sides to end this as quickly as possible. How do you think they should go about that?
First, I think that there needs to be a conversation with all the NATO allies. I think they need to sit down and have a frank conversation on what is it that Putin wants versus what Ukraine wants, right? And I think diplomacy works when you have the right people at the table, the right partners, when you have heads of state who are willing to engage in authentic conversations and negotiate in good faith. It can work. It can work if the parties put the interest of the people first versus their own personal interest. Because we know war, it's about ego, right? The ego plays a critical role. While we understand that Putin argued that if Ukraine were to join NATO, it will be disastrous for his nation from a national security perspective, which some would agree and some obviously would disagree. But I think, again, diplomacy is the way to go, and these sanctions that are being imposed will force Putin to withdraw out of this war to ensure that the people of Ukraine are able to defend themselves. And obviously, the people of Russia could be able to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, because right now, with all of these sanctions being imposed, the economy is going to be severely crippled.
Indeed, it looks like interesting times ahead. One can only hope that diplomacy will win out, as you suggest. Thank you so much, Yana LeBlanc, for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
We'll take a break, and when we return, we'll have more stories on the various reactions and actions relating to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Please stay on with us.